This lesson, we're going to be covering off some JavaScript syntax. So previously we saw how we can use query selector, interact with our HTML, and we also saw console log and console directory. So there are a few things to note when you are writing JavaScript, and the way that JavaScript handles white space, the way that JavaScript interacts with itself, and also how you can do debugging with JavaScript. So first of all, console log and console directory that were introduced in the last lesson, this is where you can communicate within the console. So this is behind the scenes, gives you some more information on what's happening. There's also a few other ways to communicate with other developers and as well as yourself or your future self when you go back and you look at this code and you wonder, what was I doing over here? Why was I writing hello world instead of JavaScript? So you have the ability to make comments. So comments are done with doing the 2 forward slashes, and then in here you can write comments. And what happens with a comment is you're not going to be able to see it. So this is strictly for other web developers, anyone that's looking at your code, including yourself, to kind of reference later on. There's also block comments. So you could do comments and then you could do a number of lines of comments, and sometimes that's a little bit tedious. So a new line and so on and so on. So you might want to do a whole block of content. So let's say, for instance, all of a sudden you don't want this information and these functions being invoked. So you can block it out. So / asterisk, and that blocks out a chunk of code that isn't going to be visible. There's also white space and how white space is handled within JavaScript. So we saw over here we have an equal sign and we've got spacing here and spacing here. So you can get rid of the spacing if you wanted to. And do you think it'll still work? And if you said yes, you are correct. So just like with when we're typing our HTML code and we refresh it, it still works. All of this extra white space is ignored. The spot where the white space isn't ignored is between the quotes. And what's going to actually happen here when I refresh it, we're not going to see any difference. Because what's happening is that all of this white space, because it's rendering out HTML, it's being actually ignored because we're writing out strict HTML. And even though if you do go to the source here, and I know within the browser here you can go into the source. So this is actually the same thing as writing this within your HTML. And if you are familiar with HTML, the way HTML handles the white space, it only creates that one space. So even though if this is on a new line, it will handle it within that same format. And if you saw what just happened whenever I created the new lines, JavaScript doesn't work the same way. So whenever I create a new line, it's expecting a new statement. So when I refresh it, we're going to see that the JavaScript actually breaks, and JavaScript doesn't get changed to hello world because instead of just the empty spaces, I created line breaks, and those are a no-no within JavaScript. So you don't want to be putting lines like this and refreshing it because it does become problematic. So it's problematic within here, but it's not problematic within when you're writing out your source code. And that's why when we are writing out our source code, we've got a number of options to make it look nice and neat. We can get rid of the spacing here and we can represent it. And also when you're doing indentation, you can see that by default, whenever I start a new line, brackets is already trying to do that indent of the code. So it's trying to keep it nice and neat every time we've got a break here that we've got a new block, then it's trying to indent that block. So that's what's happening within bracket. And also when it comes to JavaScript, the way that it works is for readability, you might want to do it this way as well, where you've got this part of the statement, and then this could automatically be on a new line. So even though if you don't need to set it to new line, you can set it to a new line. And even when I make it bigger, it can still be sitting on the new line. And that's how line length and line breaks work. So when you are writing your code, if you do want to make it neat and so on, you already want to make those line breaks, you can do that as well. There's also in cases when you're blocking chunks of code together. So those are code blocks. So essentially those are blocked together, and JavaScript uses a series of brackets. So it uses these rounded brackets. It also uses these curly brackets. And we are going to be getting into that in the upcoming lessons. So there's also a few really there's a few keywords within JavaScript, and it does take a reservation on that wording. So there are ones that are used that are the default methods. For instance, you can't do something like alert without actually doing the alert method, because this is already built in to the browser. So it's already expecting that function with those parameters. So you can't change that, basically. And as well as document. It's not a good idea to rename the document and do something different with the document, because these are words that are being used within JavaScript. And there are some very common ones, and we are going to be covering those off as well. So always keep that in mind when you are writing your JavaScript, that there are reserved keywords as well. So now that we've covered off basics of writing JavaScript, you're ready to start writing some more JavaScript. That's coming up.